We all want to be happier, but how do we get there? First, we start by realizing happiness is not a destination. Being happy consists of micro action steps every single day. I'm your host, Brittany King, and I'm here to guide you along the way. Hello, my beautiful friends, and welcome back to the Positively Real podcast. And I am so excited for this conversation. This month, I have dedicated every episode to mental health awareness because May is Mental Health Awareness Month. But let's be real, mental health awareness is not just reserved for the month of May, but I just figured that I could use my platform to highlight different areas of mental and emotional well-being and then bring experts on to talk about all the things. And so today I have Lillie Duncan, and she is one of the amazing therapists at Turning Point Counseling. And if you listen to my podcast, you have heard Rachel multiple times. Rachel's a dear friend and a client of mine, and now we collaborate and do different things together. And so when Rachel introduced me to Lillie at one of my breathwork classes, I just instantly felt connected to Lillie. And I was like, I got to have her on the podcast specifically because of the way that she approaches the mental health in general. She uses mind, body, and spirit. And that's also very aligned with the work that I do as well. And Lillie's emphasis is attachment therapy. And attachment, I feel like attachment styles and attachment therapy has been kind of buzzing around a lot lately. I mean, maybe it's just more in my world because I've been focusing on it in my life and I'm seeing it show up in clients' life, but I feel like it's having a moment right now. So Lillie, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And you're right, it is a buzzword. And even though it's a buzzword, if you really get into conversations, sometimes people still have a really elusive idea of what attachment is.
Yes. And that's why I wanted to have you on the show so we could really make it clear for people because I feel like it comes up a lot in conversation. And I feel like there's still a lot of confusion around what attachments are and where they come from and how this shows up, because I've noticed this in conversations of just like, oh, well, I'm this and they're that. And I'm like, I feel like there's so much more to it than just labeling.
Yes. Oh, I love that you said it. Yes, there is so much more to it. I'm excited to dig in. Um, a lot of people so I'm a therapist working with attachment science, attachment theory, but I didn't always start here. I actually started years ago working with Dr. Dan Allender. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but he is out of the Seattle school up in Seattle. He had a part in playing with that, and then he opened up the Allender Center. And although trained therapist, he started doing more story work. And this will relate soon. And within the stories, we were starting to understand when going through this training and when starting to do story work, I was getting a really good idea of attachment being so deeply connected to our stories, right? Mm-hmm. And so years ago, I mean, that was my personal journey was exploring my own story. And then when I loved the work so much because of what it was doing in me, I sought more training. And I actually went backwards, right? So before even becoming a therapist, I went the other way. I went and did story work training first and then used that and took that into becoming a therapist. And so now on this side, I have this really eclectic way of working for people and working with people. And it is consistently, I don't want to say it's working, right? Because that makes it sound like healing. It's either it works or it doesn't,
Mhm.
but it's productive. Like it actually gets to the core
Mhm.
of stories and then gets to the core of attachment.
Mm. Mm. That is so beautiful because it's like realizing how much of our life is through this lens of a story that like blocks us from actually seeing different parts of ourselves, seeing different parts of the world. And so the work that you're doing is so powerful. And I love that you emphasized on like, don't want to use the word work because it's either it works or it doesn't, because that's not true, because it's an ongoing journey. It's not
Yeah.
an end point.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. It is an ongoing journey. And I mean, even for myself, there's constant reflecting inwards. And one of the things I was thinking about when just kind of sitting before the show and thinking about attachment is wanting to dig in really, what is attachment? Where do we have miscommunication? And then where can we look a little bit deeper? And so one of the things that I hear a lot, and I did a reel about this a long time ago, and I don't do many of those. So if it happens, it's because I like
yeah,
really,
you
yes,
really, you're like, this is
yeah,
necessary. This needs to get out there in
yes,
the world.
yes. I am what I consider a hermit therapist. I only come out of my shell when I'm like, this has to be heard. And
Mhm.
one of them was that you are not your attachment style.
Mhm.
So, because it's a buzzword, because of social media, and like, thank goodness for social media, right? But we don't want to stop there. We can get into these situations where we just start identifying ourselves as something. So, we get into these I am statements. I
Mhm.
am anxiously attached. I am avoidant. I am disorganized. And when we step into a space where we actually start to agree with an identity, right, that's not safe and secure, right, that has lack, we get ourselves into a funk. Does this
Mhm.
make sense?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm
And
so glad you
yeah.
bring that up, because that's what I noticed a lot of working with clients that are starting to understand this. And they're like, I am this, I'm anxious attachment. And they start like that becomes a part of their identity and the story that they tell about themselves. And I'm so cautious of labeling like that, because it really does skew how you view yourself, view the world. And in a way, it kind of gets you off the hook for doing the work. Like it's like, oh,
Yes.
well, I'm this and this is just how I am. Like it's not like, oh, it's like you kind of just like throw your hands up and you're like, well, nothing I can do about it. I'm always going to be afraid I'm going to be abandoned. I'm always going to be afraid of this. I'm always going to be this. And then it kind of stops you from actually going inward and doing the work that you can do to actually transform that.
Absolutely. I believe that so much. So part of what I wanted to bring today was I just wanted to open and expand our view on attachment a little
Mhm.
bit. And so I'll start by saying, if you have any listeners that are not familiar with attachment, that essentially the basis is how we connect and attach to other people, right? When we're younger, of course, this is going to be parents or caregivers. But then as we grow older into adulthood and thereon, whatever the template was in our adolescent years becomes the way that we subconsciously begin to attach to the world around us. But there are caveats, and I will jump into that caveat in a minute. So we'll talk about the attachment styles. I just go with the most basic names. You have secure, and then you have your anxious, you have your disorganized, and then you have your avoidant. Are those the terms that you pretty much come across as well?
Yeah, I think that, yes, I feel like that's like the basis. And I think different people have different ways they identify with it now. But
Mhm.
I think at the very root of attachment styles, that's what I've heard the most.
Oh, absolutely. And because I mean, nothing is as concrete as I'm completely avoidant or I'm completely insecure.
Mhm.
We just don't work that way. We're humans and we're fluid in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. And it's actually the places where we become stuck is where we want to pay attention, right?
Mhm.
And so avoidant is just like the name says, just pulling back. It's really just avoiding attachment. Disorganized is going to be a mix of avoidance and anxious. And anxious is this, I'm afraid somebody's going to leave,
Mhm.
right? And then you're secure. I mean, this goes back to, as humans, we're created whole. And so everything about what we're doing and healing and therapy is just returning back to wholeness. And
Mhm.
so when we're doing this work, our goal is just wholeness. And so that's what I equate. to a secure attachment.
Mm.
But here's the caveat I was telling you about earlier. So how I work with people, I it's somatic story work is what I call this. And so I take in the story work that I learned from Allender. I take in all of the stuff from school that I learned, but then I integrate internal family systems. And this is parts work. Have you dug much into
Mhm.
IFS and part work?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. It's amazing. It's like, it's interesting too, because I, I like before I understood parts work, I always would say, I feel like there's a part of me, like it's like almost like we intuitively know without knowing what that actually is.
100%.
It's very fascinating. And then once you start to understand it, it all starts to make so much sense. But for the longest time before I knew what IFS was, I would always say, like, there's a part of me that's feeling this way, or there's a part of me that wants this. And it was always really fascinating. And then you learn it, and I'm like, so interesting. So if you want, just in case someone's listening and they're not familiar with parts work, do you want to break that down as well?
Yes, absolutely. And that's perfect timing because I'm going to give you a little bit of my take on parts work too.
Yeah.
So I wish I could do a whiteboard for everybody and really break this down. It would be so helpful. I just need to make
little
all kinds
little
of
Venn
things out of
diagram,
this.
like, okay, and here's
Yes,
you, and
yes.
then this is.
Listen, I actually do that in session. I'm like, look, this is not going to be pretty, but
I
it's
do
going to
that.
help
Sometimes
so
I'll do
much.
that. I'll be like, and here, and then sometimes
Yes,
I'll look at my desk and be like, I don't even know what that scribble was, but had a purpose.
yes. It works. So like, especially if you're a tangible person, right? But
Mhm.
this is how this, and we will tie this back to attachment. But this is how it works, right? So if we're created whole, and we're born into this world whole, we call that, and in parts work, we call it self, right? Capital S self. And I equate that to soul, right? And that is soul, spirit coming into a human body, having this human experience, right? That is just nothing is quieting the voice. There's pureness in who we are, self energy, calm, content, curious, right? But however, we come into this world, and then depending on what the dynamics were in your household, friends, school, like what happens is depending on the type of relationships and the events, sometimes this is where parts start to come off of self. And let me explain. So let's say you had a minor situation where you had a sibling, you had two siblings, and one of them just constantly overtalked the other one, right? So let's say for sibling one, the little girl, her brother was just always talking over her, always shutting her down, never let her talk, right? We look at it from this perspective and we're like, yes, like growing, I understand. But you step into that little girl's personal reality, and what's happening at 5 or 6 is she can't talk. Like, no, nobody is listening. The little boy isn't listening. This is a primary person in her world, a primary attachment. And so from that moment, there's a potential for this exiled part to be created. And so this is a part that maybe isn't seen, isn't heard. Maybe she wasn't able to repair it with brother or talk to a parent, right? There's so many different situations that would create this, but
Mhm.
basically it's a breach and a break, an attachment somewhere,
Mhm.
or traumatic event like one of those one-time
Mhm.
traumatic events that actually from self energy takes the part away and creates it as an exile.
Mhm.
And so say you have one at 5, right? The same little girl grows up, and then at 12, she has something else. Well, maybe it's about her body.
Mhm.
Maybe somebody mentioned something about her body and that she has to earn to be liked or loved, right? And
Mhm.
then let's say at 15, it's something else.
Mhm.
And so she has all of these parts that are starting to step away from self energy, right? They start to accumulate. It's not just one inner child, it's as many inner children that have not been integrated back into self, right?
Mm.
So
Mhm.
we're digging a little bit into the parts, right? So that same woman grows up, and then she starts to develop other parts, and these are the protector parts. And they're actually developing likely when that first exile is being developed, right? Because this is protective, and our body and our mind are so smart, and they're always trying to keep us alive,
Mhm.
always, right? Those protective parts are constantly connected. And I would say probably more connected to the amygdala
Mhm.
than any of the other parts because the amygdala is the fire alarm.
Mhm.
It's like, hey, there's danger.
Mhm.
And but danger could be related back to when she was 5 and brother wasn't listening to her.
Right. Like the
Danger could be
perceived
anything
danger.
that felt. Yes,
Mhm.
exactly. The memory, like that part
Mhm.
has its own set of triggers and
Mhm.
its own set of dangers. And so the manager is just keeping track. And
Mhm.
I always picture the manager with a clipboard and it's just, this
Mhm.
is how we're going to stay together. Yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
Yeah,
um,
that makes sense.
right. So now, yes. Well, there's also firefighters that act out in other ways. I always find it funny that they're called firefighters because I feel like they're the ones that actually start the fires,
I think my
right?
sister has another name for them because she's really familiar with, I can't remember what, but I think she had a similar thought of like fire. They're not putting out fires. They're starting fires.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
100%. Right. And, with the managers, what ends up happening is sometimes they start to form maladaptive behavior.
Mhm.
But if you knew their story, you would be like, oh, of course. Well, of
Right.
course you're doing that. You're
Right.
just trying to survive,
Right.
right? Of
Like
course, you're
protection.
100%. Literally, those parts are just trying to protect self,
Mhm.
but also all of the wounded younger parts, right?
Mhm.
So hold that.
I have a
And
quick
then let's
question
bring
about
it
that though.
attached. Yeah,
Quick question.
absolutely.
So, okay, so the exiled is essentially the wounded inner child because like we don't come into the world our essence as a child is not wounded. It's pure, right? And then an
Mhm.
experience happens and then they become it's an exiled part. So what you're saying is like there's multiple exiled parts, right? And then it's multiple like it's essentially wounded inner children or is it one?
Mhm. Multiple,
Multiple. So it could, I mean,
multiple.
it could be like, when you are a child, but then it could be teenager too, like something that happened, like
Mhm.
you said, like in high school, for example. Okay. And then so is the protector then connected to the ego or is that separate? Because like there's self,
Oh,
which is us, this whole, but then there's the ego, which I like to me, I feel like when the ego shows up, that's trying to protect from feeling a past pain.
okay. This, I love this conversation.
I
I
think
like
that's
eat and
why
breathe
I was like,
this.
I'm
He's
definitely on the
like,
podcast, so I can have these conversations. Like, I could talk about this stuff all day, and people in my life don't want to have these conversations with me.
I like literally hear the word ego. I'm like, yes. Okay, let's go.
Let's go.
Okay. So when I'm drawing my pictures, right? So when I draw the picture, I actually do this really big umbrella and I say, this is your subconscious, right? And
Hmm.
then over on the other side of the paper, I just do a really tiny umbrella that's conscious.
Right.
Because most of the time when we start doing this work, however we enter into this work, whether it's body or therapy, doesn't matter. Most of this is hidden underneath the subconscious.
Right.
And then we have the conscious. I equate the subconscious to ego, right? Like that would be the place that I would put ego,
Okay.
but break it down a little bit more. To me, how I visualize it in my head and my mind is like if ego to me is just like the face. It's the face that the
Hmm.
world sees.
Hmm.
And part of that I feel like is mainly made up of manager, but then you
Hmm.
have some pieces that what I see in my head is like a mosaic, right? Of
Hmm.
all the little tile pieces, right?
Hmm.
Some of it may be tile self parts right there. A lot of it is manager parts. And then sprinkled in deeper places, you have this exile, the exile
Hmm.
parts put in. And so the
Hmm.
ego is just it's really what the world sees.
Mhm.
And this is why it's also, oh my gosh, I love this. But this is why it's also so important when you're doing this work to actually break down the ego,
Mhm.
because those pieces are all lodged there because they have learned how to exist in this world. And if you
Survive.
take one piece out, likely the whole thing is going to crumble
Mm.
anyways.
Mhm.
And then your managers start to freak out because they're like, wait, I have managers, I imagine, are like, no, I've created this ego
Mhm.
so that you will survive in
Yeah.
relationships and social conditions,
Mhm.
um, with yourself. I've like
Mhm.
hidden things from you so you don't see, right?
Mhm. Mm.
And I
Mm.
can go more into that with attachment. But does that answer your question about ego in this?
Yes. Yeah, that 100%, even the visual of kind of the mosaic and then the ego being like, no, I like curated this as a to protect you, right? So you can survive in this world in your relationships. Um, yeah, it's like it is so true because it's like the conscious mind, it's like you like your visual of like it's over here and it's small and it's thinking about like what are you going to wear and what are you going to do later
Yes.
and what do you wear, like what shoes are you going to wear, and what are you going
Yes.
to eat, and what are your weekend plans, right? And then the unconscious part of our brain is doing everything else, like I'm sitting on a chair. I'm not aware of that until I say I'm sitting on a chair, or just in general, like how I'm interacting with the world. It's like, you're just so not aware that that's there until you start
Yes.
doing this work and you bring it to life. I mean, that's why people say they have ego deaths, and it's like really painful. Like, really, it's a very uncomfortable feeling when you start facing these things.
Oh, 100%. It is. I mean, there's been many people that just they say it's dark night of the soul
Yeah.
because all of these pieces they were they were put there for a reason,
Right.
right? And they're connected and they are attached to us. It's not, yes, we use the imagery of the mosaic, but imagine that mosaic literally tied to your body,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
your
It's like,
psyche.
right. Like the blueprint of your body based off of all of the experiences that you've ever had. And then we don't have to go into the generational stuff, but then also the stuff that's been lovingly handed down.
Yes.
Okay, so that clears that up. And I think that that's really helpful for people to understand parts work and the ego. So how does attachment theory tie into this?
Okay. I love this.
They're like, let's
Okay.
go.
Yes, let's do this. Okay, so my approach to attachment may be different than a lot of what's out there. And I'm just okay with that, right? And so, normal attachment theory is just saying, most of the time you can take a quiz, you can take a test, and they're like, hey, this is your attachment style. For some people, that is really helpful. But I haven't met many people that have the same attachment style to every single person in their life. I
Thousand
started to
percent.
notice,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I
It's
started to
different.
notice a theme.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, working with clients and even self, I'm just like, okay, so with Jen, you're perfectly great. You have this really secure, safe.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I'm making up names, like I'm just making up names, just so we're clear, right?
Yes.
With Jen, that you're perfectly secure
Mm-hmm.
and you have this really wonderful, stable relationship. But with this other friend that you've known just as long, it's really rocky and you're anxious all the time if they don't respond back. It's so noticing that that started to be the case for so many clients, I dug in a little bit more. And this is what I figured out in parts work, right? If you are operating more in the subconscious and not in the conscious, meaning you don't know what parts are at
Mm-hmm.
play,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know who's attaching to who,
Mm-hmm.
right? You may have a 5-year-old with a certain attachment and a certain attachment style that is different from self, that is different from a 12-year-old self, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where it starts to get really mingled and it can
Mm-hmm.
start to feel really confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, you can have an overarching attachment style, but for some people, there may be some variance actually depending on the parts within them. Does that make sense?
Yes. So Why is that? So I've noticed that within my own attachment style with like particularly friendships. And I've noticed like there are certain friendships, if I don't hear from them, I'm more anxious attached. And there's other friendships that I'm very secure in. Why is that?
That's such a good question. And I would really dig into the what's happening. So first, like what's happening in the body when that
Oh, I
friend's
can
not responding.
just
Yeah.
pure
Yeah.
panic.
Pure
It's
panic.
so interesting because I've noticed that. I mean, like, I feel like you get into this as like a, in your own self discovery journey of like, yeah, you take the first quiz and then you read
Mhm.
about it and you're like, that's me. And then you just kind of chalk it up as that. Right.
Yeah.
Um, but when I have had this experience in the past, or yeah, I don't hear from them, I instantly think they're mad at me or I've done something wrong. And what happens in my body, it's like panic. It feels like really racy and uncomfortable. Like I'll like, and then I start thinking about it a lot. So I'll start ruminating. And so then that like
Mhm.
panicky, like tight feeling. And a lot of times fear manifests in my stomach. And I used to not realize I was like, I don't know, I always said stomach aches. Like it was actually anxiety, which was actually fear. And if I didn't hear from someone, like a specific person, I could feel it in my stomach. And I would like, it wouldn't like, I'd have a tummy ache for like days. Right. And then, hear from the person. They're like, got a new phone, whatever it is, like had nothing to do with me. But that's like, I
Yes.
mean, usually that's the case, right? It's like,
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
oh, you were actually like in Africa on a safari for 2 weeks. Like, like, oh, and you were just living your life. You weren't over there mad at me
Right?
thinking I'm a terrible person. But that's,
Yes.
but then there's other friendships where I don't talk to someone for like weeks or sometimes months. And then we talk again and it's like nothing, like I don't have a doubt in my mind
Mhm.
that,
Yeah, absolutely.
so I'd say in my
Yes.
body, it's like the difference is like the tightness and the fear and the contraction. And then with the other relationships, friendships in particular that are secure, it's just like open and
Mhm.
warm and there's no fear there.
Yes, absolutely. And what I would say to that is, these two different friends that we're hypothetically talking about,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost as if they're both mirrors. So the
Mm,
one friend that you have a relationship with, something of them is mirroring back that which you already feel inside, right?
mm-hmm.
And I'll dig more into that. And so that's going to be a part typically that's coming up, right? And you already said it. You are already, let's side note this. Every part also has its own version of its body. It has its own way of seeing its body and own way of using the body. And so when you start talking about your stomach, I'm instantly like, okay, there's a part there, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's right. And it's not really about the other person,
Right.
but something of that part picks up some type of dynamic about the relationship or how the other person relates to you that seems to cause a panic. And
Mm-hmm.
you would only know the panic because you've experienced it somewhere in your story before.
Mm. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah. I
Because
use this
they're,
story a lot. Oh,
no,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, I use this story a lot to really drive this home. If, okay, I'm a mother, I have three. If my oldest girl, and this is all hypothetical, if my oldest girl came home one day and she was really angry and angry at me, and she called me some silly name that I had never heard of in my life, I would probably just giggle and like really curious, like like what's happening within you, like have my focus still on her, still this real secure attachment. Like, okay, what do you need?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, take that same situation because this silly name, I've never been called it. So I have no connection to it. I have
Mm-hmm.
no history to it. Like it could be the silliest thing, some made up name. let's say she comes home and she calls me the worst name for a woman you could think of,
Mhm.
right? For me, it starts with a B, right?
Mhm.
She calls me that. I all of a sudden a part will come forward
Mm,
that I work on a lot. A part will come forward and I will step into that insecure attachment.
mm,
Oh my gosh, what have I done wrong?
mhm. Oh,
Right? And so, yes, what have I done wrong? But
mhm,
here's the thing, it's the same scenario in both. But the first one, it doesn't land in me because I have no story with it. I
mhm,
have no parts to activate. The second one, there's a trigger. And
mhm,
I only get activated because the part, it's like keyword, heard this before. Okay, rev up, right?
mhm,
Rev up the attachment style, rev up the security, rev up the protection. What's wrong with you? And also figure that out so you can make sure that you're okay.
mhm.
Speaking for anxious attachment people, right? Like that's,
Mhm, mhm.
yes, exactly. You
Yeah,
get
I'm like,
it.
yes, this makes a lot of sense. I feel very seen. So this really does, so that example really does hit home. I'm sure for anyone listening that can really resonate with the attachment or the anxious attachment style. But in particular, the same scenario, but different reactions because you don't have meaning behind it. I always use an example like that with like purple hair. If someone came up to me and was like, I hate your purple hair, it wouldn't mean anything. So my hair's not purple. And like it'd be like, okay. But if I did have purple hair and I was insecure about it, and then someone came up to me and was like, I hate your purple hair, it would I feel like I would go into some sort of protection mode or I'd go into defense or I'd start, questioning it or call my stylist and be like, I need to dye my hair back. Because I already have meaning behind it. I was already feeling insecure about coloring my hair. And I know that's a silly example, but that's kind of how I see it. It's like it's either like you have meaning behind it or not. And the more meaning behind it, the more the emotional reaction to whatever the interaction is. So this is really interesting then, because with like you're saying, like when something like let's say you have a reaction, let's say you have a friend that you're doing things with and you have like different you're putting on events or you're putting on different things for the community and then like they're just nothing, right? Like there's just no communication about not working together anymore, nothing like that. And your body is essentially signaling to you apart, right? So let's say you start being like, what did I do wrong? You start questioning yourself, you start looking into, like blaming yourself. So you're saying, like, when that is happening, then your body is trying to signal to you a part that is present.
Absolutely. You're on it.
Okay. So then
And
what do you do
and
from there?
even
Oh, go ahead.
no, you're good. I was just saying, and even as you explain that, I can even feel that in my own part that
Mm-hmm.
knows that, right? I can feel it in the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
The heart starts to beat a little bit because it knows,
Mm-hmm.
right? It knows that feeling. It's an abandonment wound, right? I
Totally.
feel like most wounds can really be narrowed down to abandonment, um,
Mm-hmm.
rejection, and betrayal, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this one feels a lot like abandonment, right?
Yeah.
And so, wonderful question. What do you do?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the work, right? So, we're essentially, attachment style we use and I use is really just a location tool for your parts.
Mm-hmm. So like
Okay. So,
it's
you're,
essentially an access point.
exactly, right? Just like the body is an access point, stories are, attachment. Okay, like you come to me, I'm feeling this way. Okay, perfect. I have a door in.
Mm-hmm.
That part is signaling a little bit. I want to follow. Let me go into this door, into the pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And being this work, on the other side of the pain is always a gift, right? But it's
Mm-hmm.
going in
Like
that
having
is
the
the
courage
hardest
to go
point.
into it.
Oh, 100%. And then once we have that access point, we let go of the identity of attachment. And really, it's a practice of just turning towards with compassion and like, thank you for showing me, body. You're
Mm-hmm.
so smart to
Mm-hmm.
react this way, to let me know that there's something deeper. So then we go into the part and really start to map out, what is this part like? What's the message? What's the fear? What are the stories? Right. And a lot of times if you do have somebody who identifies mostly as anxious attachment, there's going to be a lot of stories that likely have a very similar theme.
Yeah, the pattern is
Uh,
very,
yes.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like,
Of securing love, but also
mhm,
being terrified when
mhm,
somebody leaves.
mhm,
Right. And then it has everything to do with the ego, the view of self, and the
mhm,
security of self.
mhm,
So then I take it, we do that work. But then this is the part that I love. Okay, attachment work is not just to do with other people, it's to do with the parts inside of yourself. And for me, I have this belief that, as within, so without,
mhm,
because we're only experiencing things on this side, on the outside of us, because of the stories we hold. And so if
mhm,
I can help facilitate and reattach my parts that I have also abandoned or have
mhm,
forgotten or have just shoved down out of protection, that's where I like to start with attachment work,
mhm.
right? Like if you're in these other situations and really wanting to work on attachment with other people, yes, it can be done, but it's got a variable that we can't really dig into, and it's the other person.
Right.
What we can work with is us. And
Mm,
go deeper, we work with our parts,
mhm,
right?
mm. It's so good. I mean, it's like, I feel like we hear this a lot. Like, you can't have, like, the relationship with yourself really determines the relationship you have with other people. And like that intellectually makes sense, but this really explains it so much deeper. Like, how it's like, yes, you have to have a good relationship with yourself to have a good relationship with others, but this is the why. This is why it's so important.
Oh, absolutely. I'll be honest. Doing this work so long, I was like, that's just bull. I don't believe it because I couldn't access it,
Right.
right? It was the protector part of me
Totally.
that's just like, that's silly. There's no self healing. Like, no,
Right.
let me find all of the answers outside of myself.
Hmm.
And that works until it doesn't.
Right.
And
Right.
then there's an ego death somewhere.
And then there's the ego death, and then you really have to pause and be like, it is interesting. It's like, I shows up all the time in myself, but also within my clients. It's like, it always comes back down to us, even when you change something externally, whether that's a job or a relationship or a friendship or location. And like, temporarily it's like, yay, the shiny object, it's new and it's exciting. And then once that wears off, then it's like dealing with this again. It's like, oh, because you actually haven't addressed this internally first. And that's where we start to notice patterns. And I've started to notice these patterns within my relationships. And it's so easy. And I'm so glad you brought up self compassion, because it's like, it's so easy to default to judgment and shame. Like, it's just, you go there, at least for me, go there first, or I have for most of my life until I started doing this work. And it's do, defaulting to self-compassion is really hard. I don't know if you really can, like, at least for me, I haven't had the experience where I instantly default to self-compassion, but I have enough awareness to know when I'm going into judgment, because I've learned the reason why I keep repeating this pattern is because I'm judging myself, I'm criticizing myself, I'm shaming myself, and I cannot learn. There's all this science, like, there's brain scans now to show what happens in our brain when we are in a shame spiral. Like, it literally puts us in freeze. Like, our nervous system shuts down as a form of protection. Like, our prefrontal goes off. It's like a blanket over it. And then the studies now with self-compassion, it's like all these different parts of your brain are like lit up, and that's how you can learn. So it's like, of course these patterns are still there. And then for me, and then I'm judging myself, I'm like, well, I have this great awareness, but I'm still repeating these patterns. So like, what does this
Yes.
self-awareness do? And like, then it perpetuates the cycle on until you are really willing to like shift and pause and reflect and go to that place of self-compassion and make and validate how you're feeling and why that part is showing up. But you can't do that unless you know what those parts are.
Yes. Oh, it's so good. Self-compassion is one of the concepts too that a lot of my stronger managers were also just knock that off the table. I also
Mhm.
was like, no, it doesn't exist.
Yeah,
Um,
it's like it's such a fluffy
right.
idea, like when you think about it. And
Mhm.
it's not. There's like so much science and research behind it now.
Oh, 100%. And how I equate self compassion, it's the equivalent to unconditional love.
Mhm.
And I would be curious. I need to look it up. You could measure the frequencies of the different emotions and whatnot. Um, I feel like compassion is up there with love and gratitude if you were to
Mhm.
measure it.
Mhm.
Right. But here's the thing about compassion, and I'm still testing this out, right? Because I'm still human and still learning and don't know it all yet. But this is what I've come to learn about compassion and self compassion. It's something that I don't feel I can learn out of a book, and I
Mm-mm.
can't really teach it. I can
Mhm.
model it,
Mhm.
and that's how somebody else will learn it,
Mhm.
right? And vice versa. The times where I feel like I've been most self compassionate is because I've been able to have a memory of someone being compassionate to me.
Mhm.
So modeled,
Mhm.
right? Not just, there's not like a 10-step thing to it. Yes, there are actions you can do to help
Right.
create the fertile ground, but it's really being shown like, okay, I can do this, right? This
Mhm.
person was compassionate to me. I can be compassionate to me. And that's
Mhm.
why it's so important to have really compassionate people in your life. Like,
Mhm.
so, so important.
Mhm. Mm. So good. So the attachment style is the doorway. Essentially, it's the portal, the door to walk through, to talk to that different part that is showing up. What do you do from there?
Absolutely. From there, I get to know the parts. I really get to know their needs and their
Mm.
fear and the story that has perpetuated the fear.
Mm.
And oftentimes it's the process of turning your face to that part and witnessing, right? Like it's
Mhm.
the bearing witness that is the compassion that starts to disintegrate the shame that
Mhm.
keeps people stuck in time loops.
Mhm. Mm. That makes so much sense because a part of why that fragmented piece exists is because most likely experienced it in isolation or alone, right? It's like when you have a big
Exactly.
emotion and you don't know what to do with it and you don't have someone to help you either process it or hold the space for it or whatever, give you the tools to work through it, then you're just, in isolation in your inner world experiencing it. And it's a lot. It's we're not equipped as children to handle those big emotions.
Absolutely. And, there's this misunderstanding that only people with really traumatic childhoods
I know it's
have anything other than secure attachment. It's just not true.
no.
We're just human and having human
Mm-hmm.
relationships, and it happens all the time. And it's honestly, for me, I feel more of those micro moments that add up over all the years, and then you think there's nothing there. That's more damaging.
I agree. And it's honestly like a little that's like a part of my um healing journey. Cause it was like the story that I would tell and the story I would tell myself was like my childhood was good. Like there wasn't anything, like I was, born very privileged, parents got divorced. Like I just like I literally believed this story. Like, and then as I started to notice these patterns and get a little bit more into the healing work, I realized like that is it's almost sneakier. Like if you look at,
Mhm.
ACE childhood scores, it's so much easier to identify these things within like those higher scores. But then what about the people that like don't have the high childhood trauma, but are
Mhm.
exhibiting a lot of the same symptoms? Because a lot of like so much of the stuff that we're dealing with in our today is a symptom of something going on much deeper and it's sneakier. And I remember when I thought I'm still going to a somatic therapist, but the first time I saw her, she even called that out. She was like, the type of trauma that you've experienced is very like insidious and kind of like invisible.
Yes.
And it was like, I felt so seen. And then she also like gave me language to what I always tried to understand and make sense of, but like couldn't put the words to it. And I remember when she told me, she's like, you have developmental trauma. Like they're like during like the key years of your development, these like micro traumas happened and it caused a delay in your development. And I was like, the first time I was like, oh, like it was just like, it was so clear to me. I was like, I've always tried to articulate this, but I could not find the words. And then when she was able to put the language to how I felt and like inside, it was like it all made sense and I felt seen. And I like it slowly started to change that the story that like I'm defective or there's something wrong with me.
Yeah, absolutely. What a powerful moment with her to be able to be seen like that and for truth just to be labeled.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because
Yeah.
I
Like,
feel like what once we can just see clearly, then we know what we're working with. But
mm-hmm.
when it's so hidden,
Right.
just
It's so
have no
easy that the
idea.
story just continues on. It just will continue like, oh, there's some, this is just how I am. Let me hide it. Let me push it down. Like that's where the ego really is like, let me put on this mask and let me show up in
Mhm.
this way to protect all of this like pain and all the things you can't even understand about yourself. So yeah, it's like that's a very profound. And in one of my earlier podcast episodes, I share a little bit about my healing journey and kind of what led me to this point. But you know, this work that we're talking about right now, it is so powerful for so many reasons. So, what have you found? I know we've only really talked about anxious attachment because that selfishly, that's my that is the attachment style that I identify with. So, shocker that we went down that route. But you know, I think this it all makes sense to each different attachment style. So, what else do you want to share about specifically attachment style and how it relates to parts work? Like, do you find with the different types of attachment styles, like the approach is different or is it kind of the same?
That's a really good question. You're right. We talked a little bit more about anxious. Typically what I see when talking about avoidant is it's actually harder to identify the parts because
Yeah,
there's
avoiding, they're
avoidance,
hiding.
right? Like
Makes
they're literally,
this is
yes.
making very good sense to me.
So I like to use the house model. It's like the manager, as you're growing up, the manager takes these exiles and like puts them in closets, locks the door, and then throws the key away. And so you walk into this house the manager has made, right into walk into the existence of who you are, like everything is good to go. We're
Mm-hmm.
good. We got everything packed away, don't even know they exist. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
it feels like to work with more of the avoidant type parts, and not necessarily meaning that the parts inside the doors are avoidant, but maybe that manager is, maybe the firefighter, maybe the protective mechanism is just keep everything so still and far away that we don't touch the things that hurt the most, those core pains, core beliefs about self and about attaching to other people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then disorganized is, to me, it's just a mixture of both.
Mm-hmm.
It's I just don't know how to exist in this world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that could just be all of the parts having so many different feelings and happening all at once. It's like
Mm-hmm.
maybe 1 minute I don't want you near me, and the next minute please don't leave me,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely a really, really hard place. I have a lot of compassion for that space. But
Mm-hmm.
it's the same way in,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're just saying, okay, that's the entryway. Let's get into the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm doing couples work, so I love bringing this into couples work. There is a technique called emotionally focused couples therapy. And this was really founded by Sue Johnson, which unfortunately is like late Sue Johnson. She just passed, but
Mm-hmm.
she is the forerunner. Like she took a lot of this attachment science and brought it in to couples work in a way that is just powerful. And one of the things that I really learned from her is, you have two people in a relationship, and this is true for parts of themselves. But to have a really well functioning relationship, you don't have to have secure and secure. Like I
Mm,
really believed that like I could only have a secure relationship if I was securely attached. But again, we're fluid.
mhm,
And if you are coming into a relationship with stories, right? Really hard stories, and what an expectation to have on yourself to always not be able to meet. Like that's hard. What
mhm,
if instead we just had this understanding that maybe some days I'm going to be anxious and maybe some days I'm going to be avoidant with the common goal of seeking secure together,
mm,
right? So,
mm. That's an
yeah.
that's a beautiful approach because and like what you said about it being fluid of some days it's going to be this and some days it's going to be that, but the goal is to land in that secure place. And I think at least for me, it's like we want to skip that and just be secure and realizing that that's, I mean, just not necessarily realistic. It's a very unrealistic expectation to have, especially when you look at your whole entire life and building like finding evidence to support this attachment and really building more of a case for it, because that's just what our brains do. We want to confirm what we already think is true and through our stories. So with, my brain keeps going to my daughter. Like, how do I make sure I help her develop secure attachment in the world? And I know it's not just with her main caregivers. I know it's teachers, it's siblings, it's friends. I mean, it's like all over with your relationships, but it starts with your primary caregivers.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I love this question. And working with motherhood has just been something that I have loved for years. For this right here, for a long time, I had a brand name just redeeming motherhood, just because I
Mm,
really wanted to redeem what
yeah.
secure looked like in motherhood. And yes, there is going to be the influence of friends, but you know, science shows that the caregivers are going to be the primary
Hmm.
blueprint and template for her attachment system and for her parts. And I'll get into what that looks like. But what you model for her will also be how she addresses her parts and how
Hmm.
she will create that secure attachment within and also without. And I love this when talking about motherhood, because here's the thing, we're not going to get it perfect all the time.
Hmm.
And our goal is not to be perfect. It's actually more beneficial to show them how to miss the marks. And then this is the key part. This is the integration. We have this breach in attachment.
Hmm.
That's always going to happen. This is what creates secure attachment, repair, coming back together
Mm,
every time.
yeah. So it's almost like I'm so glad you said that because I've had multiple instances where I've been triggered and I then, of course, will default to shame after, be like, you're a terrible mom. I can't believe you did that. But because of this work, I know to repair. And what you're saying is like the breach is an important piece of building secure attachment. So instead of thinking like what a mindset shift, right? Like what a reframe. Instead of thinking, well, I totally just screwed up this human for the rest of her life. It's like, actually, yay, I did the first step really well. I caused a rupture. Yay. It's like it's such a different shift. And it's not, obviously I'm not gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna see how many times I can rupture this relationship. But what you're saying is like you need a rupture in order to repair. And so that's how you build secure attachment.
Yes, absolutely. And so,
Mhm.
what I equate with repair is integration. So,
Mhm.
just like with your daughter, you go to her and speak to her and repair. We model that. We do that with our parts too,
Mhm.
right? When we've abandoned ourselves, when we have when we have quieted our voice, right? In certain situations, we go to that part. I am so sorry. Like your voice matters and it's needed. And I'm working really hard to let you have more space, right? So that's an internal work, but that's also what we're modeling with our children. And also, our children as mothers, okay, I cannot tell you, my children have been forerunners for me because they
Mm,
constantly teach me
mhm.
my need to repair, but also how to do it. But
Right.
how to do it.
How to
And
do
it's
it
just,
and how to
yes,
like,
and
how to
having,
mean it, like, to do it, but to actually, like, mean it versus the, like, "I'm just gonna do this to do it," because there's a huge difference between the 2.
yes, yes, absolutely. And this brings me to my overarching theme with healing when it comes to attachment in parts is so often because of the day and age we live, we want to fix,
Mm,
we want to do. We're just like, okay, tell me how to fix it and I will do it. It doesn't always work that way. And for some people, it's really challenging. And I actually love when that is a challenge because I want to sit with it and know why. But this type of healing is experiential.
mm,
There's no to-do list, right?
I love
Just
that.
like when you go to your daughter and you repair, it wasn't 5 steps. You're not reading off of a clipboard and like, this
No.
is what I need to do. And then you're going to forgive me and we're going to be great. No, it's
Right.
experiential. It's the
Yeah.
felt
Yeah.
experience of being connected again. And then that
Being
teaches her,
reconnection.
I don't have to be perfect.
Mhm.
And I can have emotions, right? Like if mom got mad and she was frustrated, she came back and let me know and like we repaired. Mom was Mom is showing that it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to feel feelings,
Mm,
right? And we do our due diligence if that frustration came off, right? But this is an experience. This is the human experience.
mm,
And it can't be done down to steps. It
mm,
has to be a felt journey.
mm. Oh my gosh. Yes. Way to bring it home, Lily. Like those words are poetic and so beautiful and they're so true. I mean, I'm right there with you. I mean, my daughter's only 2 and she's taught me more about myself in her 2 years of existence and mostly, I mean, in the past 6 months in particular. But it is the experience. And yeah, you like, you hear people talk about it, but it like you feel like, let me pull up the script real fast and go through the checkpoints. And something that I noticed, and you just nailed it, and it like so glad you brought this up to tie it all together because the repair with yourself and the parts of you is what's missing. And I've had this realization the other day is like I'm like constantly trying to be better. Like I value growth and obviously like being in this work and it's just been a part of my life for a very long time, as long as I can remember. Um, and it's so easy to get into that fix it mode of I need to fix this. I need to make this better. Um, and what you just said really resonated with me of like going to those parts and repairing with each part individually. And so when that part comes up, it's like instead of silencing it again or being like, no, 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 it's not a problem. Like, let's just keep moving. Let's find something else to do. Let's do the thing to help this. It's like just being with it is actually the answer versus, oh, like I need to go to therapy. I need to do this. And like, yes, like therapy, it holds the space for it to have this experience, right? Like it's an experience. And I love that that's kind of how you tied it all together because that's what led me to somatic experiencing. Because I'm like, I've been doing all this stuff on a surf, like I've been doing this all in my mind. I've been doing like changing my story, changing my beliefs, like all of my work, and it's been amazing. And it's only got me this far. And it wasn't until I had my daughter that I was like, there's something else like there's something else. And I was so approaching it from I need to fix it. Like there's like childhood trauma, complex PTSD, like just being like, I need to fix all of this so I can be better. But what the piece that I've been missing is just this self-acceptance of like exactly where I am. And so you just saying that really kind of like tied it all together of how powerful and important this particular work is.
I'm so thankful that landed. And I'm right there with you. I mean, it's experiential and it's powerful. And I'm doing the work too,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's part of the experience.
Yeah. Oh, it is. It is a part of it. It's definitely easier to be unconscious to it, but it's like it's just so limiting. And I feel like even this conversation feels very liberating in the sense of going like having the experience is what it's about. Oh my gosh, Lillie, this has just been such an amazing conversation. Even before we hit record, I was like, I'm not Huberman. I can't have a 3 hour long podcast, but I feel like we could just keep going for 3 hours.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's so good. Okay, so anything else that you want to share about what you do, attachment theory, the parts work, your approach to it before we wrap up?
That's such a good question. I feel like most of it I covered, but I will make a recommendation. If your listeners are wanting to do this work, right, that they don't have to go seek out right away. Right? Maybe just their first step is being able to turn awareness in and just see who's there, what parts are present. So maybe just starting by noticing, and that would be enough for now, and just seeing what's there and what needs to be done,
Mm.
what work or what may be calling. I feel like this when we listen, the soul often tells us what it needs and where to
Mhm.
go and what to do.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love it so much because it goes back to the like, not necessarily like into like taking action right away. Because someone listening might be like, I need to do this right now. Um, I think, you know, there's timing and so many different things that go into starting to do this type of work. But to your point, just bringing that awareness of like, oh, I'm feeling this way. Like, what part of me is that? And just starting to get curious inward is a beautiful starting place. And it doesn't require doing, it requires being. And I think that's like when we think about our daily practices and like, why do we meditate? Why do we journal? Why do we do these things? It's like for this reason, not just because every wellness guru has said that it's good for you. It's because you're actually able to, when you quiet the mind, like you said, the soul speaks, and that's really going to give you the language of the body. And the body is constantly trying to communicate, but it can only get through when you listen, you give it the space, or else it starts screaming at you.
Yes, yes, that should be a part two somewhere down
Part two
down
is
the
like when
line.
your body says no mas. Like your body's
Yes.
saying, hello, check all the lights are on the dashboard. Why haven't you been paying attention? Well, this has been
Oh,
so lovely. You are such a lovely human being and you have such a calming, grounding energy about you. And this is just, I can tell why, you know, when Rachel was just like glowing about you, I can 100% see why. Just even the way that your approach to this is so different and also refreshing. You know, it's such a different perspective and on this work, and it's incredible. So thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for being here on the show with me. Where can people find you?
I love this. Just thank you. I feel so honored. You can find me online. I will send you my email. It's hello@lillieduncan.com, but then also Instagram handle is at lillie.duncan, and it's LILLIE.DUNCAN. And those are the best ways to get a hold of me.
Awesome. I will make sure I put that in the show notes. Anything else that you want to share before we wrap up?
No, I think
No.
that's it. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Thank you so much. Okay, so my last question then is if I was to interview your friends and family and ask them what your superpower is, what do you think they would say?
Oh, I 100% know. uh, I'm a seer. I
Yeah.
see with my body, I see with my eyes closed, and so I feel. And I feel like I used to have a different relationship with it. Now this is why I'm in this work because I get to feel. There's times where I'm working with clients and I can feel the parts.
Yeah.
Like I actually can help them identify what parts are present because I like, okay, I feel it. Like this is the boundary of it. This is what it feels like. Um, but that shows up in my family too.
Amazing. What
But
a
yeah.
gift. And I remember it's like you mentioned like a part of yourself like resisting this part of you for a while of like the gifts that you have in your intuitive gifts and shifting into just embracing them more and allowing them to be present.
Well, oh, absolutely. There was for a long time, I just steered away from anything mystical because I was so afraid I wouldn't be taken seriously
Mhm.
in my work. And when I let go, that resistance, just flood of the gifting came upon me and getting to work hand in hand, right? In this work with the science, I mean, it all goes together,
Mhm.
all of it,
Yeah.
science and spirituality and the soul. I'm like, bring it to
Bring
me.
it to
I will
me.
take all of it.
I love it. I was to say where the woo meets the work. It's like they go
Oh, I
hand in
love that.
hand. They go hand in hand. I had this other gal on the podcast who uh, is she's a relationship expert, but she has a big science background too. And we were talking offline, and she's like, I'm very spiritual. She's like, but I like the hard, cold facts. I'm like, yes, it is so good. And
Yes.
like the data and the research and
Yes.
all of that. And it's like, it's so important to have both because it really does back it up. It's like, yes, it's like woo woo and metaphysical, but really when you distill it all down, it's deeply connected. And there's a huge
Oh,
intersection with it.
absolutely.
So oh, it's so good. Okay, well, we're gonna wrap up because before this turns into Huberman Lab, but I appreciate you so much. I will put this in the show notes so people can reach out to you if there's any questions. Make sure they follow you on Instagram, and don't be surprised if we have part 2 coming up this year because this was so fun.